Welcome to the Deep Dive, the shortcut to being well-informed, where we plunge headfirst into the source material so you emerge with only the most essential and fascinating insights. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a truly colossal figure, someone who didn't just write novels, but, you could argue, fundamentally shaped the Victorian world and perhaps even defined modern celebrity. We're talking about Charles John Huffam Dickens.
Absolutely. We're dealing with a genuine phenomenon here. Born 1812, died 1870, and consistently, cited as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. His popularity during his lifetime was, well, frankly, unheard of. It transformed him into this worldwide media star long before mass media as we even understand it existed.
So what's our mission for you today? It's kind of complex, isn't it? We need to peel back the layers.
Exactly. We want to understand how his earliest really deep personal scars fueled this phenomenal literary output, and also how he cleverly engineered his own celebrity, and what specific stylistic but also commercial innovations turned his storytelling into such a global publishing powerhouse.
And when we talk about his work, it's not just a couple of famous books, is it? The sheer volume is staggering.
Oh, monumental. We're looking at 15 major novels, 5 absolutely crucial novellas, including, of course, the immortal A Christmas Carol, hundreds of short stories, essays, massive amounts of journalism, too.
Right, and all this was tied to this tireless, lifelong commitment he had to social campaigning. Things like children's rights, education, even public sanitation. He was really active.
And his cultural impact is so pervasive, we still use his name practically every day. The term Dickensian, it's become this really potent adjective.
It has those two key meanings, right?
It does, yeah. Meanings he himself really perfected. On one hand, it refers to those harsh social and working conditions, often tied to grim, dirty institutional places like workhouses or prisons. But at the same time, it also describes characters who are exaggerated, sort of comically repulsive or defined by these ridiculous quirks. And that dual definition, I think, perfectly captures his unique skill, blending this brutal social realism with really sharp, vibrant satire.
That blend, though, that mix of, righteous anger and almost theatrical comedy. It didn't just appear out of thin air.
No way.
To really get the world he built in his fiction, that dense, murky London, we first have to understand the world that kind of broke him, the world that inflicted wounds that maybe never truly healed. So we have to start with his childhood and that abrupt turn it took.
Yeah, it's really crucial to note that his very earliest years in Portsmouth and Chatham were, by all accounts, pretty pleasant. He was the second of 8 kids. His father, John Dickens, worked as a clerk in the Royal Navy Pay Office.
Sounds respectable enough.
It does, but John Dickens, though apparently quite genial, was also catastrophically described as recklessly improvident. Yeah, he lived way beyond his means, took out loans he just couldn't repay. Classic story, unfortunately.
And that financial recklessness.
Yeah.
It leads to the event that really traumatized Charles Dickens for his entire life, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The family crisis of 1824.
That's the one. Charles was just 12 years old. His father gets arrested and sent to the notorious Marshalsea debtors' prison in Southwark, London.
And the whole family went with him.
Well, his mother and the younger children did, yes. According to the terrible custom of the time, they joined him inside the prison walls. It basically became this grim, walled-off community for people who were ruined financially.
Just imagine. And Charles, he wasn't inside.
No. Young Charles was summarily pulled out of school and put to work. This decision forced him to earn 6 shillings a week pasting labels on pots of boot blacking.
Boot blacking.
Yeah, at Warren's Blacking Warehouse. It was on Hungerford Stairs near where Charing Cross Station is now. It was just humiliating, grueling work, 10 hours a day for a boy who clearly had intelligence and aspirations.
The descriptions he later shared of that place, they're vital to understanding his later fury, aren't they?
Absolutely essential. He remembered this crazy, tumble-down old house right on the river, literally overrun with rats. You have to picture this brilliant, sensitive, ambitious 12-year-old enduring the damp, the stink, the fear, working alongside some of the poorest, least educated kids in the city.
It must have been terrifying.
And the memory just burned into him. It instilled this constant, righteous indignation. He said he perpetually wondered how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age.
You can feel the bitterness there.
Yeah.
And that experience didn't just stay an emotional scar, did it? It became actual material for his books.
The literal bedrock of his fiction. He later told his biographer, John Forster, the precise origin of one of his most infamous characters, Fagin.
From Oliver Twist.
Exactly. The boy who showed the young Dickens how to tie the specific knot on the blacking pots. His name was Bob Fagin.
Wow. So that direct link, his personal abandonment tied forever to the dark world of child crime he would later expose. That's incredible.
It really is. And the trauma went so deep it affected his personal relationships moving forward, too, particularly his feelings towards his mother, Elizabeth Dickens.
How?
Well, when his father finally got released from Marshalsea, it was after a small inheritance came through. Charles expected, naturally, to be immediately rescued from the factory.
Of course.
But his mother resisted. She actually suggested he stay there a little longer, just to keep bringing in those few shillings a week.
Oh, no, after what he'd been through.
Exactly. That decision was crushing for him. He recorded it later in a letter just filled with pain. I never afterwards forgot, I never shall forget, I never can forget, that my mother was warm for my being sent back.
That's harsh.
It is. And this perceived failure by his mother, her failure to champion his immediate return home, it's frequently cited by biographers as contributing significantly to his later, often complicated and sometimes dissatisfied attitude towards women that you can see in his fiction and, frankly, in his life.
So the pain became the source material, quite literally.
Yeah.
The physical location of the Marshalsea prison.
Yeah.
It shows up again, doesn't it?
Oh, prominently. Described with exquisite, painful detail in his later novel, Little Dorrit. And the emotional devastation of that whole period, that became the defining, intensely autobiographical core of David Copperfield.
His most personal novel.
Arguably, yes. The hero recounts having no advice, no counsel, no encouragement, no consolation, no assistance, no support of any kind from anyone. You just feel the echo of that lonely boy in the warehouse.
So having lived through the system failing him firsthand, that personal pain became his creative fuel.
The ultimate creative fuel. Once he found his voice, he could channel those traumatic memories into these universally compelling narratives. But to reach that massive audience he eventually found, he needed more than just genius. He needed the right platform.
Which brings us to his brilliant understanding of mass media and commercial timing. He was quite savvy.
Extremely savvy. He did eventually get back to school for a bit, worked as a junior clerk, but the real breakthrough came after he mastered this incredibly complex system of shorthand, Thomas Gurney's system.
Shorthand, like for reporting.
Exactly. He became an exceptionally quick and accurate freelance reporter, and he started publishing these sharp, observational journalistic pieces, his sketches, using the pseudonym Boz.
Boz. I remember that.
Yep. And then came the revolution, really, 1836. The debut of the Pickwick Papers.
Now, this wasn't initially meant to be a huge literary event, was it?
Not at all. Quite modest beginnings. The publishers, Chapman and Hall, they simply wanted some text to go along with a series of sporting illustrations by an artist named Robert Seymour. It was just meant to be a simple, sort of picaresque narrative with pictures.
But it didn't stay simple, did it?
Yeah.
The narrative just exploded. People talk about the Sam Weller bump.
That's exactly it. The introduction of this witty, instantly quotable Cockney character, Sam Weller, in the fourth installment, it caused this sensational surge in sales.
What was it about Weller?
He was just this charming, streetwise philosopher type. He gave the novel this much-needed injection of popular humor and energy. People loved him.
So it wasn't just a literary success. It became a commercial phenomenon.
Right. Absolutely. Initial sales of the first few parts were maybe only in the hundreds, but by the time the final double installment was released, they were selling an astonishing 40,000 copies of each part.
40,000.
In the 1830s.
It's incredible. The academic John Sutherland, he rightly called the Pickwick Papers the most important single novel of the Victorian era, precisely because it fundamentally changed how literature was consumed and marketed. People went crazy for it. There were Pickwick cigars, Pickwick china figurines, Wellerisms quoted everywhere.
And this success revealed Dickens not just as a brilliant writer, but as this innovative, an authorpreneur.
That's a great way to put it. He fully utilized the new technology steam-powered printing presses, the rapidly expanding railway network to maximize distribution. He got his work out there, and he was incredibly savvy about capitalizing on his popularity. He made sure his books were printed in cheap, paper-bound editions that the working class could actually afford, but also in these luxurious Morocco and gilt bindings for the wealthy gentry. He covered the market. That financial strategy itself was pretty radical for an author back then, wasn't it?
Oh, completely radical. Before Dickens, many authors just sold their copyright outright for a flat fee. They got nothing more no matter how successful the book became.
Right.
Dickens, often through really hard-nosed negotiation, pioneered retaining his copyright and demanding per-copy royalties. He understood his fame was an asset, and he demanded ownership of his creations. It made him independently wealthy and, yeah, a true capitalist of literature.
And his commercial success was so directly tied to the format he mastered, that serial publication, usually in monthly parts. Can you talk a bit more about how that specific format, getting the story in installments, shaped his unique narrative style?
Oh, it shaped absolutely everything. Firstly, it mandated suspense. It required it. The reliance on cliffhanger endings at the end of each monthly part created this widespread, almost feverish anticipation, something a book published all at once just couldn't replicate.
You had to wait a whole month to find out what happened next.
Exactly. Imagine waiting 30 days to know the fate of a character you'd become invested in.
I think the most famous example of that fever is the story about the old curiosity shop, right? With Little Nell.
That's the iconic one, yes. American fans were supposedly so desperate to know the fate of poor little Nell that they gathered at the docks in New York, and as the British ships carrying the latest installment arrived, they'd shout up, pleading for news. Is little Nell dead?
That's incredible. That level of public investment, it's like waiting for the season finale of a massive TV show today.
Precisely the same dynamic. And beyond just generating suspense, the installment structure allowed for this rare kind of responsiveness, something we don't often associate with high literature.
What do you mean by responsiveness?
Well, Dickens could literally read the reviews as they came out month by month. He could track the sales figures for each part. And crucially, he received letters directly from his readers.
So he could tweak things as he went.
He could. He could modulate his plots, maybe emphasize certain characters, even shift directions slightly based on public feedback, almost in real time.
So he was sort of adapting his art live in front of the audience. But surely, while the public loved this format, didn't some literary critics at the time, and later, argue that serialization actually forced him into being maybe overly melodramatic? Or sacrificing artistic unity for the sake of those constant commercial cliffhangers?
Oh, they absolutely did. Later critics often pointed to the sometimes sprawling, almost chaotic nature of his plots, or the occasional reliance on, well, pretty convenient coincidences to wrap things up.
Right.
But Dickens defended the structure. He argued it allowed him to evolve alongside his audience, and, importantly, to address current events directly as they were happening. He was a product of this rapidly changing media landscape, and he just leveraged it perfectly. There's a famous example with David Copperfield. His wife's chiropodist complained that the character Miss Moucher seemed to reflect her own physical disabilities in a cruel way. Yeah. And Dickens actually responded to the public outcry about it. He softened the character in later installments, gave her more positive features. It shows this rare, immediate connection between the creator and the consumer.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And all the excitement generated by this revolutionary format, it served that greater purpose we talked about earlier. It allowed him to deliver these really potent, often quite radical messages about social inequality straight to the mass public, not just to the literary elite.
Precisely. His role quickly went beyond just being a novelist. He became this crusading social critic, using fiction as his primary weapon. He famously declared his belief that virtue shows quite as well in rags and patches as she does in purple and fine linen.
Meaning morality wasn't just for the rich.
Exactly. It wasn't the exclusive domain of the privileged. And he wasn't subtle about who his targets were. He used his fiction to hold specific institutions accountable.
Like with Oliver Twist. That came out not long after the Poor Law changes, didn't it?
Just after the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, yeah. Dickens was absolutely furious with the new workhouse system it created. And the novel genuinely shocked the Victorian middle class with its raw depiction of poverty, child crime, the cruelty of forced institutionalization. It opened people's eyes.
And he was just as devastating when he went after the legal system, wasn't he? In Bleak House.
Oh, Bleak House is incredible. The central plot revolves around this endless generation-spanning legal case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. It was just this profound, searing satire on the Court of Chancery.
Which was known for being incredibly slow and expensive.
Notoriously so. Known for its procedural delays, the ruinous legal fees, its sheer inability to ever actually conclude anything, Dickens depicted it as this consuming fog that destroys every life it touches.
And the novel actually had a real-world impact, didn't it? It wasn't just art for art's sake.
It had had a very real, measurable effect. The description of Chancery was so accurate and so widely read that it contributed significantly to a major legal reform movement in England. This eventually led to significant legal reform acts in the 1870s, specifically aimed at improving the Chancery courts. So fiction literally helped change the law.
I'm amazing. And he didn't stop at legal issues. You mentioned hard times earlier. What
Yeah.
was his target there?
In Hard Times, we see his indictment of the cold, calculating philosophy of utilitarianism, especially as it was being applied to industrial society. He attacks the system that reduces human beings to mere statistics, to quantifiable units.
Right, the character Mr. Gradgrind.
Exactly. The factory owner, Mr. Gradgrind, embodies this philosophy. He demands facts, facts, facts. He dehumanizes his workers by literally reducing them to hands, just mere appendages of the machines they operated, completely stripping them of individuality, emotion, heart.
And to deliver these powerful, sometimes quite didactic messages, he relied on this singular genius he had for characterization. His figures, often drawn from real life, but then exaggerated, elevated by this incredible linguistic creativity, and those names, the satirical names, are unforgettable.
The names are half the story, aren't they? Mr. Murdstone in David Copperfield, it combines murder and stony coldness. You know exactly what you're getting.
Or Mr. Pumblechook, the corn chandler.
Sounds like an onomatopoeia for smugness and self-importance, doesn't it? These aren't just names, they're instantaneous psychological portraits. Brilliant shorthand.
And these unforgettable figures were often drawn directly from his own domestic life, which has another really fascinating layer when you're reading. Mrs. Nickleby, for instance, the rambling, slightly ridiculous widow in Nicholas Nickleby that was based on his mother.
Reportedly based on his mother, Elizabeth Dickens, yes. Interestingly, she apparently never recognized the portrait herself, maybe because Dickens exaggerated her qualities so much for comic effect.
And his father.
Conversely, Mr. Micawber, the eternally optimistic but always insolvent gentleman in David Copperfield, he was lovingly constructed from the less admirable aspects of Dickens's own father's character, that rhetorical exuberance and complete inability to manage money.
So he could satirize his parents, but maybe only if they were cloaked in layers of fiction and humor.
It seems that way. It gave him a way to process those relationships, perhaps.
Now, speaking of universally recognized characters, we absolutely have to dedicate some time to his greatest novella, A Christmas Carol, published in 1843. This was intended, wasn't it, as his sledgehammer blow for the poor?
That's how he described his intention, yes. And you could argue it was his most successful blow ever. It managed to address the urgent need for generosity towards the poor, but without demanding specific legislative change. It worked on an emotional, cultural level.
And it basically reinvented Christmas, didn't it?
It spearheaded this huge mid-Victorian revival of the holiday, absolutely. It repositioned Christmas from being a fairly minor religious observance into this central, family-focused festival celebrating generosity, cheer, charity, community.
And it gave us so much of the language we still use. Merry Christmas became much more common after the book. And obviously, Scrooge.
Permanently added Scrooge to our lexicon to describe a miser. The impact of that short book is just immeasurable. It tapped into something deep.
Before we shift gears towards his more complicated private life, let's just briefly touch on his literary lineage. Where did he fit in? He was clearly influenced by older traditions, like the picaresque novel.
Definitely. You can see echoes of Fielding and Smollett, that tradition following the episodic adventures of a roguish, often lower-class hero navigating society. But he also took the popular forms of his own time melodramatic fiction and really bent them to his own will.
How did he use Gothic differently?
Well, that's a key distinction. He ushered in what some critics call the Gothic shift. Traditional Gothic novels relied on exotic, usually historical locations, ruined castles in Italy, isolated abbeys, spooky continental dungeons.
Right, very atmospheric but distant.
Exactly. Dickens took those core elements, the mystery, the sense of foreboding, the oppressive atmosphere, secrets, hidden guilt, and he relocated them squarely into the modern urban environment of London.
So London itself became the haunted castle.
Precisely. London functions almost as a character in his novels. He described it as a magic lantern, projecting these eerie scenes. The traditional gloom of a castle was replaced by the dense, murky, oppressive fog rolling off the Thames, seeping through the gaslit streets of Westminster or the alleys of the city.
Which made his social critiques feel much more immediate and genuinely terrifying, I suppose. The horror wasn't far away, it was right outside your door.
That's exactly the effect. And underpinning all of his style, all his techniques, was his lifelong love for Shakespeare. He called Shakespeare the great master. His own love for dramatic storytelling, even amateur dramatics, which he pursued avidly, definitely helped shape his intensely theatrical prose and his incredibly dynamic dialogue.
You really see that complex mix, the dramatic genius, the profound morality, the sharp social criticism in everything he wrote. But here, I think we come to the central contradiction of the man.
Mm-hmm.
The man who so passionately championed virtue, who exposed society's secrets and hypocrisies in print. He was simultaneously working incredibly hard to conceal turbulent and frankly scandalous private life behind this monumental public career he had so carefully constructed.
And this takes us directly to the immense price of fame, especially in the Victorian era. Dickens was intensely, almost pathologically sensitive about his public image as this ideal family man, this moral leader.
Which made his midlife crisis, starting around 1858, even more explosive. It resulted in the sudden separation from his wife of 22 years, Catherine Hogarth.
And it wasn't just the separation itself, it was how he handled it that turned a personal tragedy into this colossal public scandal.
Right. He didn't just separate quietly. He went public.
He did. He attempted to justify the separation by publishing statements, even in his own magazine, Household Words, that basically smeared Catherine. He went so far as to accuse her of having some kind of mental disorder and suggested she was incapable of managing her household or being a fit mother to their 10 children.
Which was incredibly cruel and, by most accounts, untrue.
It was seen as an act of extreme malice, even cruelty, and it shocked many of his contemporaries. Even his close friends and literary peers, people like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, were absolutely disgusted by his conduct towards Catherine. He was essentially using his huge public platform to try and rewrite his own domestic history, to paint himself as the victim.
And the underlying reason for this desperate scramble to control the narrative, to silence Catherine, was his relationship with someone else.
Yes, his lasting passion for the young actress Ellen Ternan. Dickens was 45 when they likely began their relationship. Ternan was only 18.
That age gap alone was scandalous then.
Hugely scandalous. And in Victorian England, where divorce was virtually impossible for someone of his standing without causing ruinous social consequences, a long-term affair, especially with a much younger woman from the theater world, it was an existential threat to his entire carefully curated moral brand, his image as the champion of hearth and home.
So he engaged in this monumental act of concealment.
Absolutely. Utter secrecy became paramount. He famously destroyed almost all of his personal correspondence from that period, thousands of letters burned.
And Ellen Ternan did the same.
For her part, yes, she apparently reciprocated by destroying his letters to her. This created this almost complete void in the historical record regarding the intimate details of their relationship.
Which has fueled speculation ever since.
It ensures that the full extent of their relationship, which many biographers now believe included them living together secretly for the last 13 years of his life, and potentially even having a child who died in infancy, remains largely speculative, based on clues and interpretations rather than direct evidence.
So that's the essential irony we have to grapple with, isn't it? The writer who made his name exposing hypocrisy became a master of private hypocrisy himself, deliberately erasing his own history to protect his fame, his reputation, and, let's be honest, his financial interests.
It's a profound contradiction. And this need for control, perhaps also for public validation and adoration, it fueled the final, most intense phase of his career. The reading tours.
Right, these public performances of his own work.
They became his primary focus. They absorbed most of his creative energy for the last decade or so of his life, and they became a major source of income, actually dwarfing his book royalties eventually.
His status during these tours, it sounds like it was absolutely equivalent to a modern global rock star.
It really was. The demand for tickets was just unparalleled. Contemporary accounts describe crowds fainting during his most dramatic recitations, particularly the scene where Bill Sikes murders Nancy in Oliver Twist. That was apparently incredibly harrowing.
He wasn't just reading, was he? He was performing.
Oh, fully performing. He gave what was described as an extraordinary exhibition of acting. He inhabited the characters, modulated his voice. It was pure theater, and the frenzy was so intense that it actually drove the rise of modern speculators, what we'd call ticket scalpers today, in major cities like New York and London. They could buy up blocks of tickets and sell them at massively inflated prices.
How many readings did he do?
He performed about 470 times between roughly 1853 and his death in 1870. It was incredibly lucrative, but it absolutely drained his health. Still, it confirmed his position as arguably the most celebrated man in the entire English-speaking world at that time.
And it was during this period, this time of high-wire public performance and intense pressure, that he suffered a traumatic event that threatened to expose his deepest secret, the Staplehurst rail crash.
Yes, Staplehurst. June 9th, 1865. He was returning from France on a train, and there was this massive rail disaster in Kent. 10 passengers were killed, many more injured.
And his carriage was involved?
The first-class carriage he was riding in was actually the only one that remained on the track, but it was left hanging precariously off a collapsed bridge over a river.
Terrifying.
Must have been.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, Dickens displayed immense heroism and presence of mind. He spent hours aiding the wounded, giving out brandy from his flask, comforting the dying, working tirelessly to help the other passengers. But there was another passenger in his carriage. Or rather, two others.
Ellen Ternan.
Yes. His travel companion was Ellen Ternan, along with her mother. Amidst all the chaos and the rescue efforts, before he finally left the scene, he apparently remembered to climb back into the wrecked carriage to retrieve the unfinished manuscript for his current novel, Our Mutual Friend.
Shows his dedication to his work, even then.
It does. But perhaps more importantly, he had to secure and protect the women he was traveling with. He had to manage the situation carefully.
Because revealing his traveling companions would expose everything.
Exactly. His heroic actions at the scene were somewhat overshadowed, in his own mind at least, by this immense pressure to maintain secrecy. He later secretly avoided attending the official inquest into the crash.
Why?
To prevent being forced to disclose under oath that he had been traveling intimately with Ellen Ternan and her mother. Protecting his public image, his celebrity, was paramount, even in the face of a mass casualty event.
The crash must have had a lasting impact on him personally, though.
Oh, undoubtedly. It left him with permanent psychological damage. He suffered from what we'd now clearly identify as profound post-traumatic stress. He described experiencing sudden, vague rushes of terror when traveling by train afterwards, sometimes having to grip the seat in a sheer state of panic.
And he used that trauma in his writing, too.
He channeled it directly into one of his later really chilling ghost stories, The Signal Man. It's a fantastic, eerie tale about a railway signalman who has ghostly premonitions of a rail accident. You can feel the Staplehurst trauma woven through it.
Despite his clearly failing health, the result, surely, of that punishing reading schedule and the constant mental stress of maintaining his double life, he pushed himself even further, didn't he? Another U.S. tour.
He did. He undertook a second, highly profitable U.S. tour in 1867-68, performed 76 readings across the country, netting a staggering 19,000 pounds of fortune back then. It confirmed his enduring market appeal, but it took a terrible toll.
And the farewell readings back in England.
Yes, he launched a final, exhausting series of farewell readings back home, but they had to be canceled prematurely after he suffered a stroke in April 1869. His doctors warned him that continuing could be fatal.
Did he stop working then?
He stopped the readings, but he pressed on, working feverishly on his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It's a notably dark, gothic tale featuring a drug-addicted choirmaster and a mysterious disappearance. He clearly knew he was nearing his end and desperately wanted to finish it.
But he didn't manage it.
Tragically, no, it remained unfinished. On June 8, 1870, he suffered another, more severe stroke after spending a full day working on Edwin Drood at his home, Gad's Hill Place. He died the following day, June 9th, exactly 5 years to the day after the Staplehurst crash.
What were his wishes for his burial?
He had expressed a clear desire to be buried relatively near his home at Rochester Cathedral, in an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner.
But that's not what happened, is it?
No. The public outcry, the sheer magnitude of his influence and fame, it was just too great to ignore. The nation felt it owned him, in a way.
So he ended up in Westminster Abbey.
He was laid to rest in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. The decision was made by the Dean of Westminster, who recognized Dickens as perhaps the greatest representative of English literature for, as he put it, all who speak our English tongue. His death only magnified his global reach and immediately led to this complex, ongoing reevaluation of his entire body of work and his legacy.
And that legacy is just staggering, isn't it? His books have literally never gone out of print since they first appeared.
Never. And they've been continuously adapted for the screen almost since the invention of cinema itself. There are over 200 documented film and television adaptations, starting incredibly early. There was a British silent film called Scrooge, or Marley's Ghost, made as early as 1901.
And his influence stretched far beyond Britain and America, didn't it? He was huge internationally.
Immense. Russian literary giants absolutely revered him. Leo Tolstoy considered David Copperfield his favorite book. Fyodor Dostoevsky called Dickens that great Christian writer, recognizing the deep vein of moral compassion running through even his darkest work.
Others too.
Oh, yes. The French writer Jules Verne named Dickens as his favorite author, praising his amazing power and felicity of expression. Even within the visual arts, his impact resonated. Vincent van Gogh was deeply inspired by Dickens's novels, citing them as influences for several paintings. Van Gogh once wrote that reading Dickens, especially The Moral Clarity of A Christmas Carol, was one of the things keeping him from committing suicide during periods of profound despair.
That's incredible testament. Now let's talk about his critical reputation, because that had a fascinating journey, didn't it? It wasn't always universally acclaimed, especially later in his career.
That's right. During his mid-career, quite a few influential reviewers perceived what they called a drear decline in his output. They felt he'd shifted too far away from the bright, sunny comedy of something like Pickwick towards a darker, heavier strain of serious social commentary.
So the audience that loved the early fun stuff found the later books, too, heavy.
That mid-Victorian audience often found his later great novels like Bleak House, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual Friend to be kind of wearisome. They missed the simple, picaresque adventures and found the intense focus on institutional corruption, the symbolic gloom where the fog or the dust heap represents societal decay to be almost too painful or depressing. They often preferred entertainment over indictment.
Yet the general public never deserted him, did they? Sales remained strong.
No, the public stayed loyal. And critically, by the mid-20th century, there was this radical shift in consensus. A new generation of critics, led by figures like George Orwell and Edmund Wilson, really championed his later work.
What was their argument?
They argued forcefully that it was precisely these darker, more complex novels, Bleak House, Great Expectations, Little Dorrit, that possess his greatest artistic depth, his most profound psychological insight, and his most powerful thematic resonance. They recognized that the darker vision was actually the more significant achievement, artistically speaking.
And his cultural omnipresence today is just impossible to ignore. His books are still constantly on lists of favorite reads.
Absolutely. His influence is, as you mentioned, literally astronomical. There's a crater on Mercury named Dickens,
Right.
and his portrait graced the UK £10 note for a significant period, which is quite an honor.
Museums dedicated to him,
Yeah.
festivals.
The Charles Dickens Museum in London is hugely popular, and of course, A Christmas Carol. It just stands alone as this masterpiece of cultural engineering. It didn't just popularize a holiday tradition, it established the entire archetypal framework: Scrooge, Tiny Tim, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come that we still adhere to today. It solidified the holiday's modern meaning around generosity, family, and redemption.
He really was, wasn't he? The first self-made global media star of the age of mass culture.
I think that's fair to say. He brilliantly harnessed new technology, he adapted to audience demands almost in real time, and he delivered this essential, often biting social critique wrapped up in brilliant, highly theatrical, and hugely entertaining storytelling.
And that remarkable life, so full of immense public virtue and achievement, but also that profound private contradiction, brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider. We've seen Dickens, the social crusader, the man who so passionately exposed society's secrets and hypocrisies in print. And then we've seen Dickens, the private man, who deliberately, methodically created this deep, personal secret, burning his letters to Ellen Ternan, trying to silence his wife, all to preserve his carefully constructed moral celebrity. So the question for you is this. When a writer strives so desperately to erase his own personal history, how does that knowledge, that secrecy, influence your perception of the sincerity, the emotional truth contained within his most heartfelt fictions? How does the contradiction shape how you read him today?